Her family's ruin forced her to wed the blind recluse, rumored to sleep in a coffin. The first thing most people notice about a stranger is their eyes, whether they're kind or cold or hiding something. I can't do that. Haven't been able to for 11 years. So when I heard the wagon come up the road that morning, heard it long before anyone else would have, the creak of the near side wheel that wanted grease, the particular weight shift of 2 people on a bench, I was already standing at the door, already waiting. I didn't know what she'd see. I knew what the town had told her. They'd said I slept in a coffin. That was Dillard Marsh's contribution, told to anyone who'd listen at the feed store. I don't know where it started. I don't know what it is about a blind man living alone that makes people decide he must be something other than a man. Maybe it's easier. Maybe a monster in a dark house is simpler than a person who just wanted to be left alone. Maybe a blind man who still runs a 1,000-acre ranch and doesn't need their help is a thing that makes people uncomfortable. And a coffin story is how you make it stop feeling like a challenge. My name is Elias Cutter. I have been blind since the accident at Sawyer Creek when a fuse burned wrong and took the sight from both eyes and left a scar that runs from my left temple down across the bridge of my nose, deep enough that you can feel the ridge of it in the dark. I know because I've run my own finger over it alone, trying to understand what other people see when they look at me. I stopped doing that some years ago. It's a scar. It doesn't tell me anything I don't already know. The wagon stopped. I heard her climb down before he helped her, which told me something. And then her feet in the dust, the particular step of someone who has decided not to be afraid of a thing and is working hard to honor that decision. Small boots, firm heel strike, not the tentative pick of someone afraid of what the ground might hold. Her father said my name. His voice was the voice of a man who has swallowed a great deal of shame and is pretending it tastes like dignity. Harold Steen. I knew the name. I knew the debt every rancher in the valley knew when Steen's operation went under, the bad winter compounded by the loan he should never have taken from Beckwith's bank. I knew what the arrangement was. My lawyer, Corbin, had handled the paperwork. Harold Steen's debt cleared in exchange for his daughter's hand. I had agreed to it because I needed someone to help me manage the house, and because the alternative was a hired woman who would leave in 6 months, and I am not proud of the logic, but it was the logic I had, a woman who had no other option was a woman who might stay. I am not telling you this was noble, I'm telling you it was true. I'd been alone in this house for 8 years, and it was doing something to me that I didn't have clean words for. Not madness. Nothing like madness. Just a kind of narrowing, the way a creek gets narrower when there's not enough rain, still water, still running, but smaller than it ought to be. I said her name before her father introduced her, Miss Steen. A small silence. Then Mr. Cutter. Her voice was low, not soft low. There's a difference. Soft is hesitant. Low is a person speaking from the chest, from someplace that has thought about what it's going to say. I put my hand out. She took it. Her grip was firm and brief, and she let go before I did, which told me something else. She wasn't here to be grateful to me. She wasn't here to be managed. She was here, and she was going to make what she could of it, and gratitude wasn't going to be the shape of that. Harold Steen left before the sun moved much. I didn't blame him. There's a specific misery in handing your daughter to a stranger, even a necessary one, and I think the only mercy I could offer him was to let him go quickly. I told him his debt was recorded as settled. He thanked me in a voice that was trying not to break. I didn't answer that either. There wasn't anything to say to it that wouldn't make it worse. Then the creak of the wagon and the sound of the wheel that needed grease going back the way it came, and it grew fainter, and then it was gone. And it was just us. She said, "Where do you want me to put my things?" "There's a room at the top of the stairs," I said. "Second door on the left. The latch sticks lift the handle as you turn it." I heard her pick up her bag, one bag not heavy. The weight of a life reduced to what she could carry on a wagon seat, and she lifted it without a sound that suggested she was mourning what wasn't in it. Then the stairs and the second door, and after a moment the sound of the latch that sticks being worked. A short pause, then the soft thud of the bag set down, then quiet. I went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on the fire and tried to remember the last time another person had moved through this house and what it had felt like. I couldn't quite get to it. That's the thing about alone. You stop noticing it the way you stop noticing a sound that's been there too long. It just becomes the texture of the air. I should tell you about the house. People in town had decided the house was also part of the mythology, dark and shuttered and half-ruined, probably. The truth is it's a good house. I built most of it myself before Sawyer Creek, and then finished what I could after. The hands who worked the north pasture in the early years helped with the framing, but the cabinetry is mine. The shelves are mine. The iron hinges on every door are mine because I didn't like the cast ones from the hardware and drove to the smithy in Callan myself and had them made to measure. I know where every edge is. I know the slope of the floor in the kitchen, and the way the third step creaks near the right side, and the distance from the corner of the stove to the water pump. 41 inches, which I measured with a length of rope the first winter after I lost my sight, going room to room and building a map in my head that I still carry, and that has never been wrong. I am not helpless. I have never been helpless. I think that is the thing that nobody in this valley has ever understood, that losing my eyes didn't take away what I knew how to do. It changed how I did it. There is a difference, and it is not a small one. The cattle work I handle with my foreman, Burl Ochner, who has been with me 12 years, and whose voice is so familiar I can read his mood in the first syllable. Burl is a tall man with a narrow face and a way of making his opinions known through the length of his silences, and he never once treated me like a man who needed things explained twice or handled carefully. He just adapted. He started calling out what he saw instead of pointing, started describing the condition of a calf in words instead of gestures, started leaving notes. He'd read them to me when he left them, and then I'd have the sound of them, because that was what the work required. That's the kind of man Burl is. The horse work I do myself. Horses are not confused by blind men. They read you in ways that have nothing to do with your eyes, and if anything I think some of them prefer it. No unexpected gestures, no quick movements they have to account for, just presence and hands and voice. My mare Nessa will stand when I put my hand on her flank and wait for me to get where I'm going, and she always turns her head when we're approaching a gate so I can feel the change in her neck and know to reach. I didn't teach her that. She just did it. Some animals understand things they have no reason to understand. But I had let the house go. I'll admit that freely. Not to ruin, I'm not the man in the story the town tells, but to a kind of bare function. There was food, there was firewood, there were clean clothes, the windows didn't leak. There was nothing extra. Nothing that was there because it made the place feel like something. The kitchen garden was weeds. The front room had 2 chairs and a table, and the bookshelves I'd built in the second year, because I needed something to do with my hands, and a shelf seemed like a thing that would last. The shelves had books on them that I hadn't found a reader for, which was its own particular loneliness. I think I had stopped believing the place needed to feel like anything. I had stopped believing anyone else was going to be in it. She noticed it before she said a word about it. I know because I heard her, that first evening, walking through the rooms, not snooping, not hurrying, just moving at the pace of someone who is trying to understand a place before they decide what to do with it. The kitchen. The front room. The back room where I keep my woodworking tools, the bench and the planes and the chisels in their rack, the smell of shavings and oil that I have always found settling. She stopped there a while. When she came back to the kitchen where I was, she said, "You made the shelves in the front room." It wasn't a question. Yes. The joints on the second shelf, the one on the left, the way the wood fits. A pause. My grandfather was a joiner. He would have said that was fine work. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was not accustomed to that. To anyone looking at something I'd made and seeing the work in it rather than looking for the evidence of a flaw, the place where the blind man must have gone wrong. "He teach you?" I asked. "Some," she said. "Enough to know what I'm looking at." Her name was Clara. The first weeks, we were careful around each other the way you are around something that might break if you push too fast. Not unfriendly, she wasn't unfriendly, and I'm not a man who is cold to people who haven't wronged me. But careful. We established the edges of each other's space, and neither of us crossed without permission, and that courtesy went both ways without being spoken, which told me we were probably going to be all right. She learned the house the same way I had, methodically, without asking to be guided, making her own map. Within 2 weeks I heard her moving through it without hesitation in the dark, which I noticed but didn't mention. She'd taken the trouble to learn the shape of the place instead of just stumbling through it and waiting for morning. That matters, that kind of attention. It's a way of respecting a thing. She cooked well, better than I expected, though I don't know why I had expectations. I didn't know anything about her to base expectations on. She made biscuits on the 3rd morning and left 2 on the table where I always sat and didn't say anything about it, just went on with what she was doing. They were the best biscuits I'd had in 11 years, which is a long time to go without a good biscuit, and I ate them slowly and thought about what it meant that she'd done it without announcement, without wanting thanks for it. She asked me, the end of the first week, if she could work in the kitchen garden. I said it had gone to weeds 2 years back, and she could do what she liked with it. "I'll need seed. Corbin goes to town Thursday, give him a list." She gave Corbin a list. I didn't ask what was on it. Corbin, being Corbin, described the list to me afterward without being asked, which is another way of saying he approved of her and was doing me the favor of letting me know. He's been my attorney for 9 years, and he's not a man who volunteers information unless he thinks it will be useful. He told me she'd written in a clear hand and thanked him by name, which he clearly felt said something about her character. It did. In the weeks after, when the weather turned warm enough, I'd hear her out there in the mornings and sometimes the evenings, working the soil, and the kitchen began to smell different. Herbs. Something green and sharp and alive. The food started changing too, not dramatically, but the way it does when someone has fresh things to work with and knows how to use them. I didn't tell her I noticed, but I noticed. What I didn't expect, what I had not prepared for, in my careful accounting of how this arrangement would work, was that she would ask me things. Not polite questions. Not the questions people ask when they're trying to make conversation while really deciding whether to be afraid of you. Real questions, the kind you ask when you actually want to know the answer. The 3rd week, she asked me how I'd come to be at Sawyer Creek in the first place. I told her about the mining claim my brother and I had staked north of the ridge in '64, and the fuse that should have burned 30 seconds and burned 3, and the way the world went white and then bright, brighter than anything I'd ever seen, and then just went. She listened without putting sounds in my pauses. Most people do that, fill the quiet so they don't have to sit with what you're telling them, so they don't have to feel the weight of it landing on them. She didn't. Then she said, "Your brother." "Dead," I said, "not from the blast, fever 6 months later." I think I stopped, found the place where the words were. I think he held on longer than he would have otherwise. Trying to make sure I'd be all right. "And were you?" Nobody had ever asked me that. 11 years and nobody had ever asked me that. Whether I had been all right. Whether, after everything, the accident and Thomas and the years alone, and the house and the long winters and the particular loneliness of a man who can hear the world perfectly and see none of it, whether he had come through something like all right. Eventually, I said. She didn't say she was sorry for me. I was grateful for that. Sorry is a word that closes a door. What she did instead was sit with what I'd said for a moment, the way you sit with something you want to respect rather than rush past, and then she said, "Tell me about the claim." What were you expecting to find up there? And we talked about that instead. About what the country looked like north of the ridge, which I could still see in my head perfectly, the particular angle of the light in the late afternoon, the way the rock changed from gray to red closer to the creek, the smell of cold water over granite, the sound of the wind through the lodgepoles up on the shoulder. She asked questions that told me she was seeing it, building it from what I gave her, and I found I liked that. I found I liked being the one who could give someone something to see. I went to bed that night later than I usually did. The story the town told was this, that Elias Cutter had gone strange after the accident, had driven off everyone who tried to help him, had become something half-animal in that house on the edge of his own land. The coffin, the darkness, and the 3 women who'd gone out to work for him in the years right after had all left inside a week, white-faced, with stories they wouldn't tell in full. What those women had encountered was a man in the worst part of his grief who did not want to be managed, who had thrown a coffee cup at the wall once, not at a person, at a wall, because someone moved his things without telling him, and he reached for his grandfather's watch where it always sat on the mantel, and it wasn't there, and the particular helplessness of that hit him sideways on a day when he had nothing left to absorb it with, who had said, in a voice that was probably frightening to hear, that he did not need someone to feel sorry for him, and that if they were here to feel sorry for him, they should leave. They left and told their version of it, and the version that got told was the one that made better listening. Clara heard it eventually. Dillard Marsh's wife came to call on her in her 4th week, not out of kindness, I think, but out of curiosity, to see up close what a woman who'd agreed to marry Elias Cutter looked like. They sat in the front room, which I know because I was on the porch, and sound carries differently than people think it does, especially in a dry summer when the air is still. Mrs. Marsh worked through the stories with the satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting a long time to tell them. The Coffin, a story about a rancher's boy who'd come to the property on a dare and fled home crying, which I have no memory of. I wonder sometimes if that one started from some other blind man's story and got attached to mine by proximity. A story about my temper, which was not entirely without foundation. I sat on the porch and listened to Clara listen. When Mrs. Marsh finally left her boots on the porch steps, then the road, then the sound of her buggy going back toward town, Clara came out and pulled the second chair a little closer than usual before she sat. I noted the distance, about 8 inches closer than she'd been sitting. She says you threw a man's horse off your property at gunpoint. I did. Was it his horse? No. A beat, was it your horse? Yes. Then that seems reasonable to me. I turned toward her. I could feel the sun on the right side of my face, which told me it was mid-afternoon, which told me Clara had sat with Mrs. Marsh for over an hour. She had given the woman an hour of her time, and apparently absorbed it all without letting any of it change her bearing. She didn't frighten you, I said. I've lived through worse than gossip, she said. Then, after a pause, the kind that means something is being decided about how honestly to say a thing, I didn't come here to be frightened, or to be sorry for you. I came because my family needed me to, and because, she stopped, breathed, because I looked into what I could find out about you before I agreed, and nothing I found made you sound like a bad man, only a difficult one. And difficult. I can manage difficult, she said. I've been managing difficult my whole life. I didn't answer that. I turned back toward the south, where the afternoon was going on without us, and I thought about what it meant that someone had looked, that she'd gone to the trouble of looking before she agreed. Nobody had ever told me that before, that they'd looked. In June, she asked me to teach her to shoot. She said it the way she said most things, matter-of-factly, as though the idea had arrived fully formed and required only action. She was cleaning up after supper, and I was at the table with coffee, and she said, I should know how to handle the rifle, in case something comes up when you're out on the range. I said, what kind of something? I don't know, that's the point of knowing how. I took her out to the fence post the next afternoon. I handed her the rifle and stood close enough to correct her grip, my hands over hers, repositioning her right elbow, checking her left hand's position on the forestock, and talked her through the mechanics, and then the breath, and then the break. She didn't flinch at the first shot the way some do. She adjusted what hadn't worked and tried again methodically, without the frustration that makes people sloppy. After a while she said, "How do you?" and stopped. "How do I what?" "How do you shoot without seeing?" "Sound," I said, "mostly coyotes making noise near the cattle at night, things moving through brush that move differently from deer or rabbit, the direction and distance from the sound." I paused. "It's not the same as seeing, I won't pretend it is. But you'd be surprised what you can track if you're paying attention." She thought about that. Then she raised the rifle again and lined up on the post and said, "Close your eyes." I waited. "Tell me what you hear." I stood there with my eyes closed, which made no particular difference to me, and I listened the way I always listen. The wind out of the north, drier than yesterday. The cottonwoods along the creek, which meant there was still good water in them. Nessa in the corral, shifting her weight, one hoof on dry ground, and the small adjustment of a horse that's comfortable. A meadowlark southeast, maybe 200 yards. The smell of the grass that was beginning to cure in the heat, and under that, faint, something cooler moving in from the west. And below all of it, almost at the edge of what I'd call audible, the sound of a wagon on the valley road, still half a mile off, moving unhurried. I told her all of it. She was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then she fired, hit the post. I heard the wood splinter, a clean hit near center. "You live in a loud world," she said. It was the truest thing anyone had said to me in 11 years. Not in sympathy, not in pity, just the plain truth of it, stated simply, and I didn't know what to do with how it landed. I said, "Most people think blind means quiet." "Most people," she said, "are not paying attention." The night in July. I have to tell you about it because everything after it was different, and I don't know how to account for what came after without putting that night in the right place first. There was a storm, real weather, not a spring shower. The kind that comes up out of the southwest in less than an hour and turns the sky the color of a bruise and means to do something about it. I was in the barn when I felt the pressure drop, that change in the air that I'd learned to read the way a barometer reads it. Nessa was already restless, moving in her stall, that particular tight circle she makes when something is wrong that she can't explain. I got her settled and the other 2 horses squared away, checked the barn doors, latched the far stall, and I was maybe 30 feet into the yard on my way back to the house when the storm came in. Not rain first, wind. A wall of it that hit sideways and took everything I knew about the yard and scrambled it. The sound changed completely. The rain came a moment after, not drops but a sheet, cold and hard, and in the noise of it the landmarks I listened for, the drip at the corner of the house, the weather vane, the sound of the gap under the fence gate, were just gone, swallowed up. I know the yard. I have walked it more times than I can count. But a storm like that is not a thing you know, it's a thing that knows you, and it takes what you have and makes something else of it. I went wrong somewhere, ended up at the fence instead of the back step, and I was working my way along the fence line trying to reorient, rain filling my collar, when I heard her. Running, not away from something, toward. The particular sound of someone who has left the shelter of the house and is moving through the dark and the rain toward the place they think you are. She found my arm before I heard her voice and she said, "I've got you." And she turned me and put one hand through my arm and the other at my back and walked me through the yard without hurrying, the way you walk someone when you're not afraid of the weather because the weather is not the problem. She said step when we came up onto the porch, and she said it the way she said most things, without fuss, just the information a person needs. The door, the warmth of the kitchen. I stood there and water ran off my hat brim and I thought, she came out in that. She didn't know where I was, she just came. I don't know what my face did. I hope it didn't do much. I'm not a man who likes being seen moved, and the truth was I was moved in a way that was hard to account for, not just that she'd come out in the rain, but the way she'd done it. The way she'd found my arm and said I've got you without making anything of it. The way you do a thing you've decided on before the moment comes to do it. She handed me a towel from the peg by the door. "Sit down, Elias." It was the first time she'd used my name. I said. She got the fire going in the stove, made coffee, sat across from me. We listened to the storm finish itself, the thunder going east and then east again and then gone, the rain settling into something that was just rain without all the anger behind it. The frogs started up from the creek. The cottonwoods dripped. After a while she said, "Tell me about your brother. What was his name?" "Thomas," I said. "Tell me about Thomas." And I did. I told her things I hadn't told anyone since Thomas himself was alive to know them. The way he named every horse he worked with, even the difficult ones, especially the difficult ones, because he said a horse with a name worked better than a horse without one. The way he'd been afraid of mice, which everyone found remarkable in a man who would stand in a flooded creek to cut a trapped calf free. He'd step around a mouse the size of a walnut with the look of a man navigating something serious. The sound of his laugh, which came out of him in a rush when something really caught him and then stopped sudden, like he was embarrassed by how much he'd meant it. He'd have been 43 now. I try sometimes to imagine what he'd look like at 43, and I can't quite get there. I told her about the last weeks, when he'd been sick and I'd still been bad myself. The bandages still on, the headaches that came and went, the way I'd had to learn to move through space again while he was learning how to leave it. We'd sat together, his bed near the window, and he described everything he could see outside. The hills, the light on the hills, a hawk over the far pasture, the color of the grass in the morning. Because he'd known I couldn't see it, and he'd thought the least he could do was give me something to look at. Clara said, "He sounds like someone worth missing." Yes, he was. Still is, I suppose. Missing doesn't stop being present just because the thing that caused it is 11 years gone. The lamp was burning. I could feel the warmth of it on my left side. The storm had washed the air clean and the kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and somewhere underneath both of those, faintly, whatever she'd done with the herbs from the garden. Everything was very quiet and very present. Clara was quiet across the table in the way she had of being in a room without crowding it, taking up only the space she needed, which was more than most people managed. I said, "I want you to know something." She waited. "This arrangement, what your father and I agreed to, I know what it cost you." I kept my hands flat on the table where I could feel the grain of the wood under my palms, the warp I'd never gotten entirely flat in the third board. "You've managed this house better than I've managed it in years. You've been," I stopped, found the word that was true, "fair to me. You've been fair to me, and I want you to know I see that." A long quiet, the sound of the rain gentler now. Then she said, "Elias, I'm not here because I had no choice." I turned toward her voice. "I had a choice," she said. "I could have gone to my aunt in Cheyenne. My father didn't know about that. He thought there was no other option." A pause. Her voice didn't change register, steady all the way through. "I chose this." "Why?" "Because of the shelves," she said. "Because a man who works a joint that carefully in a house where he's been alone for years, I thought that man was probably worth knowing. I thought he probably had more in him than the stories suggested." She was quiet for a moment. I was right. The fire in the stove, the rain on the roof, the particular sound of the house at night when it is inhabited by more than one person, and that means something. I didn't answer. I didn't trust what I'd say if I tried. "August. The heat that bleaches everything and makes the cattle slow and dries the creek down to its shallow bones. A different sound than it makes the rest of the year. Thinner, more careful. We fell into a rhythm that I think we both felt but neither of us named, because naming it might have made it into something we'd have to negotiate, and this seemed better, just the life of the place, happening between us the way a fire happens between wood and air. The mornings at the table with coffee before I went out. The evenings on the porch when the heat finally quit for the day and the valley cooled. The work dividing itself between us without being divided, her with the garden and the kitchen and the accounts, which she'd taken over from Corbin with his blessing, because she'd spotted an error in the summer ledger that had been sitting there for 2 years. Me on the range and in the barn and in the evenings, when the light was finally too far gone for any other useful work, at the bench in the back room. She'd started coming to the bench in the evenings, just sitting. She'd bring a book and read or sometimes just sit while I worked. She wasn't bothering me. She knew how to be in a room without filling it with herself, how to be company without being a presence that required management. Sometimes she'd describe something out the window, the light going off the far ridge, a hawk banking over the south pasture, the color the dust turned in the evening, and I'd listen, and I'd see it, the way Thomas had done it. I noticed that she knew I noticed. She never mentioned it. I built her a shelf for the bedroom. Didn't tell her I was going to. Just measured the wall one afternoon when she was in the garden and fitted the timber and hung it clean and level while she was making supper, and left it for her to find. I heard her go up to the room after supper, and I heard the sound of her steps stop and then her hand on the wood, the particular slow drag of someone who is tracing something with their palm, reading the surface of it. Then the stairs, and she was in the kitchen doorway. She said, "Elias." "What?" "Thank you. It's just a shelf." "I know what it is," she said. There was something in the way she said it that made me think she meant something more than the shelf. I didn't ask. Some things are better left in the air between you and the other person, where they can mean what they mean without being pinned down. She went back upstairs. I sat with my coffee and thought about what she'd said. I know what it is. Yes, so do I. The trouble with Beckwith came in September. He always came in September. That's when the notes fell due, and Beckwith ran his rounds like a man checking a trap line, working from one end of the valley to the other, seeing what he'd caught. He was a banker in the way some men are bankers, not as a profession exactly, but as a disposition, as a way of moving through the world that treats every conversation as a transaction to be optimized. He came to my place with 2 men he didn't need for a courtesy call, 3 horses on the road, which I heard from the far fence where I was checking the wire. I came up to the house before they arrived. I wanted to be on the porch when they got there, not scrambling to find where I was. He said there was a question about the Steen debt. I said the Steen debt was discharged. He said there were irregularities in the documentation. I said there were no irregularities. I had the paperwork, Corbin had the paperwork, and if Beckwith had a concern about the paperwork, he was welcome to bring it to a judge, who would find the same thing. Beckwith said he'd heard the arrangement had been, his word was unusual, in some of its specifics, and that unusual arrangements sometimes had problems that didn't surface immediately. I said, I want you to think carefully about what you're doing. You've come to my property with 2 men to imply that a legal transaction my attorney executed is somehow irregular, and I want you to consider whether you've actually got something or whether you've come here because you're accustomed to soft ground and thought this was more of it. I kept my voice flat, not angry. A flat voice with the right words in it is more frightening than a raised one, because a raised voice is a man who has lost control, and a flat one is a man who has it. A long quiet. One of his men shifted in his saddle. I heard the leather, heard the horse adjust, heard the man's boot move in the stirrup. I turned my head toward the sound. I didn't say anything. I just turned toward it, toward the exact location of the man, and let him sit with what it meant that a blind man had tracked him to the inch. I heard him settle, heard him decide he didn't want to be the problem. Beckwith said they'd look into the documentation and be in touch. I said I was sure they would. They left. 3 horses going back down the road, Not in a hurry, but not slow, either. The pace of men who have found out something they didn't want to know about themselves. I stood on the porch and listened until I couldn't hear them anymore, and then I listened to the quiet that was left. Clara had been at the door behind me. I hadn't known she was there until Beckwith started in about irregularities, and by then she'd been there quietly enough that I'd decided she could stay. She came out onto the porch when they were gone. She said, "How long did you know I was there?" "Since the second time," he said. "Unusual." "Why didn't you send me inside?" "Why would I send you inside?" A pause. "People do." "I'm not people," I said. "And you're not someone who needs to be somewhere safe while the men talk. You're the reason he came, in a way. You ought to have heard it." She stood beside me. I could feel the particular warmth of her arm almost at my elbow. Then she said, "Do you think he has something, actually?" "No, he has the habit of going at things and seeing what gives." I didn't give. "No," she said, "you didn't." After a while she went back inside and I heard her in the kitchen, and I stood on the porch for a while longer in the September afternoon, thinking about what she'd said on the porch in the spring. That she'd looked. That she'd found nothing that made me sound like a bad man, only a difficult one. I thought about the way she'd stood in the doorway just now, not hiding, not asking to be told what had happened, just there. There is a particular kind of woman who knows when to stand still and when to move. I'd known that kind once, a long time ago, when I was young and the world was visible, and I had not yet learned that it could be taken from you without warning. I had not expected to know that kind again. I thought, I am going to have to tell her something. I don't know yet exactly what. October came and the light changed. The sun dropped lower and the afternoons got a different quality, the warmth more slant than direct, and the mornings came up cold enough that your breath showed until 9 o'clock. The kitchen garden was still giving. She'd planted late-season things I didn't know the names of, and she'd bring them in and tell me what they were as she worked with them. I started looking forward to that. The inventory of the garden, what it was doing, what she thought about it. I told her she was wasted as a rancher's wife and should probably have had a farm. She said a ranch was close enough. I said it wasn't the same at all. She said close enough and moved on, which is the way she ends arguments she's already won. One evening, she asked me to describe the view from the North Ridge. She hadn't been up there yet. The first cold had come, and it would have to wait until spring. I think she was getting ready for the winter in the way you do when you've accepted that it's coming, turning toward the things you'll have to put off, getting clear on what they are. I told her about the North Ridge, the way the valley opens from up there, wider than you'd think, with the far hills on the south and the mountains you can barely see on the north in clear weather, white on their tops from September on. The particular shape of the far hills that looks like a man lying on his back, if you catch the right angle in the right light. The creek from up there is a thread, and in the fall the cottonwoods along it go yellow, and you can map every waterway in the valley by the color of the trees that found them. I described the light in the afternoon, the way it comes at an angle and makes the grass look like something lit from inside it. The smell of the air up there, which is different from the air down here, cleaner, colder, something resinous from the pines on the north-facing slopes. I described it the way Thomas had described things to me, giving it all the detail I had, the texture and the light and the sound of wind through grass and the distant sound of cattle somewhere below. She was quiet and still in the way that meant she was seeing it. When I stopped, she said, "You miss seeing it?" "Yes." "Tell me what you'd look at first, if you could see again." I'd thought about this before. In the early years when the wanting was sharpest, I'd turned it over and over. What first? The horses, maybe. Thomas's face. The ranch in winter when the snow came. The particular quality of a sunrise which I still feel but can no longer confirm. I said I'd look at you. The fire. The wind outside, still and cold now. The kind of October cold that means November is thinking about coming early. I sat with what I'd said and waited to know if I should have said it differently, or not at all. She said, "Elias, I know how I'm situated," I said. "I'm not trying to put something on you that wasn't part of the arrangement. I thought you ought to know." "Stop," she said. I stopped. She stood up. I heard the chair on the floor. Then she was in front of me and her hands came up, and she put them on either side of my face, her palms against my jaw, warm from the fire, and she held it the way you hold something you've decided about. "I chose this," she said. "I told you that the night of the storm. I chose you. That was not a small thing I said, and I didn't say it carelessly." I put my hands over hers, both of them. Her palms were warm from the stove, and her fingers had the calluses of the garden and the scar on her left thumb from the knife that had slipped in August, and every bit of it was real and particular and hers. I held her hands against my face and she let me, and neither of us said anything for a while. "I can't offer you what another man could," I said. It needed saying. "The winters are long and the work is hard, and I won't be able to see you. I want you to understand what that means for both of us." "You see me," she said. "You've seen me from the day I got off that wagon, maybe better than most men see with their eyes open." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not here for what you can't give me. I'm here for what you can." And that has been, her voice was still low, still steady, the way it always was. That has been more than I had any reason to expect. The lamp on the table, her hands under mine, warm and real. The sound of the house doing what houses do when they've stopped being a place a man lives alone and started being something else. I said, "Stay." "I already did," she said. And that was that. There are people in this valley who still tell the story about the blind recluse in the dark house at the edge of his own land. I know because sound carries and people forget that the blind man they're talking about can hear them doing it. The coffin, the darkness, the man who went wrong after the accident at Sawyer Creek and never came back to anything like right. Let them. I know what this house is now. I know it differently than I knew it before, not because it changed. The floors are the same floors, the shelves the same shelves, the iron hinges I had made in Callan still on every door, but because there is someone else in it, and that changes every room. I know the sound of her in the kitchen in the morning before I come down, the particular way she moves from the stove to the table, the pause before she pours the second cup that tells me she's heard me on the stairs. I know the sound of her in the garden in the evenings, and the way the kitchen smells different when she's been in it. I know the step she always skips on the stairs, the third one, on the right side, because she knows I can hear it and she likes to come up on me quietly, and she can't, and I don't tell her I know. Burl noticed. Burl doesn't say much, but he notices things, and he'd come to work for me long enough ago that he remembered what the place was like before, what I was like before, and somewhere around August he came up to me after a day's work and said, "That's a good woman you've got, Elias." That was the whole of it. He didn't say anything else, and neither did I, but I stood there with the late afternoon on my face and thought, yes, she is, and I knew it for what it was. A thing earned, not a thing given. A woman of quality who had looked at the facts of me and decided, freely, with options she'd kept to herself, that I was worth the choosing. That's not a small thing. I don't think there's anything larger. Corbin finalized some additional paperwork in November. Property arrangements, a few things that needed tidying now that the situation had changed from arrangement to something else. He came out to the ranch and sat at the kitchen table, and we worked through it with Clara. And afterward, when we were done, Corbin said, and I know he meant it because Corbin is not a man who says things he doesn't mean, "I believe you may have gotten the better end of this deal, Elias." I said, "I know it." Clara poured him more coffee and didn't say anything about that, which was its own comment. That winter was long. Winters here always are. The first big snow came in early December, and the valley went quiet the way it goes quiet under snow, everything muffled, the cattle in the lower pasture, the creek underneath the ice making its different winter sound. The house settled in on itself. We were in it more than out of it, the work contracting to what the cold allowed, and I'd half expected that to be difficult, two people in a house through a long winter, running out of things to say. We didn't run out of things to say. She read to me. She'd found the books on the shelves in the front room, books I'd had read to me in town before she came and had bought when I could and piled up without anyone to open them. And she started in on them in the evenings, and I found that listening was different than I expected. Not like being read to as a child, more like watching the thing happen in a lit room through a window, the words her voice and her voice the thing I was really listening to. We'd stop and talk about what we'd read, and she had opinions about things, firm ones, and she'd argue with what was on the page when she disagreed, and she'd laugh at the things that earned it. I realized at some point in February that I'd been laughing more in the last 6 months than I had in the previous 10 years combined. I didn't say that out loud. Some accounts you keep to yourself. In the evenings I worked at the bench and she sat in the back room with her book or her mending or sometimes just sitting, and we'd talk or not talk, and both were easy. That's the thing about a woman who knows how to be in a room. The silence between you is a different kind of silence than the silence of being alone. It has weight and warmth in it. It's inhabited. I made her a small chest in February for the things she kept that didn't have a good place. Joints mitered clean and a lid that sat flush all the way around. She opened it and ran her hands over the inside and said, "How long did this take you?" I said, "A few evenings." She said, "It's beautiful." Not the way people say it to be kind. The way you say it when you've looked at something and found the work in it, when you know what the thing cost the person who made it. I thought about what her grandfather, the joiner, would have said about it. I hoped he would have approved. Spring came back, the way spring does whether you've earned it or not. The snow went out of the lower pastures first, then the hills, then finally the north-facing slopes where it holds until April. The creek came up. The meadowlarks came back. Nessa had a foal in late March, a gray-blue thing that Burl said had her mother's stubborn set to the jaw and was going to be trouble and was going to be worth it. Clara named her before I thought to say anything about it, which is how that got settled. She named her June. She said it was because she wanted something to look forward to, and by June the foal would be past the difficult early part and starting to be interesting. That's the kind of thinking Clara does, practical and forward-looking, and with something in it that's almost optimism, but doesn't announce itself as such. We went up to the North Ridge in May, when the ground had dried enough to ride it. Burl had the ranch for the day and we went up in the morning and came back in the afternoon, and I let Nessa pick her way up the trail while Clara rode beside me on the roan and described what she was seeing as it opened out. The valley below, the creek thread, and the yellow gone green of the cottonwoods coming back. The far hills, the shape she'd been waiting to see since I'd described it in October. "The man lying on his back," she said. "You were right, left side if you look at the angle." "Told you." "You did." A pause. "The wind up here, different from below, cleaner and colder even in May. Tell me what you hear." I listened, the grass, the wind, the creak of the saddle, a hawk somewhere above and to the east, the cattle below, too far to see but there in the sound of the valley if you knew how to find them, the creek. And below all of it just, the size of the place, the way silence has a different character up high than it does on flat ground, the sense of the space opening out in all directions. I told her. She listened. Then she said, "I'd have picked this place. If I'd been choosing without any of the rest of it, just this place and this view and this quiet." A pause, and the man who could describe it so I could see it. I thought about that a while. The horse moving under me, the warmth of the May sun, the wind that smelled of the mountains still under all of it. I said, "You did pick it. You picked it with all the rest of it included." "Yes," she said, "I did." We stayed up there for a while. I don't know how long. Long enough to not be in a hurry. Long enough to sit on that ridge in May with the valley below and a good woman at my side and feel the particular rightness of a thing that you did not expect to have. The stories they tell about the blind recluse are still out there. Dillard Marsh is still telling them, probably. The coffin, the darkness, the man who went strange. I know what I am. I'm a man who runs a good ranch and keeps his fences and pays his debts. A man who built the shelves in his own front room, and the joints on the second shelf are sound because he did them right. A man who can hear a wagon on the valley road from half a mile and tell you whether the near side wheel needs grease. A man who sat on a ridge in May with the mountains behind him and his wife at his side and thought, yes, this is what finally enough looks like. She put her hand on my arm, the way she does when she's decided something. Ready to go back, she said. No, I said. She laughed, short and real, the way she laughs when she means it. Neither am I, she said, but we've got a foal to check on. We went back. The trail down through the grass and the smell of the warming earth, and Nessa steady under me, turning her head at the gate the way she always does so I can reach. Clara at my side, describing the last of the view as the ridge fell away behind us, the hills, the light going gold already, the dust catching it where the cattle had moved in the far pasture. The valley closing back around us. Home,